Hi everyone, I'm Wallis and I am one of the pattern drafters here at Seamwork. So today we're going to be answering some of the questions that we've seen in the community about making a muslin. So we've gotten a lot of questions and we're going to answer the most common ones. One of the most common questions that we've seen is, when should I make a muslin? And for me personally, I know that I prefer to make a muslin for pretty much every woven bodice that I would want to sew up. So this includes things that are that could be strapless, or that could just be sleeveless, or also things that have a fitted sleeve. Depending on how accurate you want to get with your fit, or how precise you want to get with it, you could also sew up muslins for knit fabrics, but I usually don't. In fact, a lot of times what I do for knit fabrics, I make something called a wearable muslin, where I use a fabric that was a little less expensive for the first time I sew it up. And then that way, if I decide that I want to make any changes, it still is something that I'm going to get a lot of wear out of, but then I can make the fit more precise for a more expensive fabric. Another question that I've seen a couple of times is people asking where they can source muslin from. So there's typical sources, like you could look at Joann's or fabric.com, possibly even eBay or Amazon. But also there are creative and inexpensive things you can do as well. One of my favorites is to go to thrift stores and pick up something like a bed sheet or an old tablecloth, and then that provides a lot of yardage for very inexpensive. So my other piece of advice for using some inexpensive muslin would be possibly even using old garments that may have had like a lot of gathers. For example, a really large gathered skirt or something like that that maybe is stained or starting to wear out. You could easily just cut that off really close to the seam allowance and just cut your muslin out just like you would a regular piece of fabric. Another thing you could do is, if you have a muslin that was maybe had like a larger pattern piece, like a gathered skirt or something like that, you could even cut out your new muslin pieces from a different pattern out of those larger pattern pieces to save some fabric. Another concern that a lot of people have is that they just are concerned that they do not have time to make a muslin. And personally, I think that making a muslin is more than worth your time. I think it's going to cause a lot fewer frustrations later on, especially if you're using a fabric that's really special to you. So I'm going to go over some quick ways to speed up your muslining process. Over here I have the July tank top, so I'm going to use this as my sample muslin. So one of the easiest things you can do is to just use a basting stitch whenever you're constructing a muslin. It doesn't have to be that durable, it just has to be strong enough that you can try it on a couple of times, possibly seam rip something once or twice, pin things. So yeah, durability isn't a huge concern with a muslin. Another thing that I like to do is on something that I want to be able to leave the seam allowance on, just to save myself the time and trouble of cutting it off, is I either like to use my basting stitch and just sew 5/8 of an inch, or on this half of the garment, I took a ruler and just drew out with a pin where my seam allowance is. So that way when I try it on, I can easily tell exactly when I sew on the facing where everything is going to finish along the armhole and on neckline. If you wanted to get even more precise with this process, you could even take some clippers and clip along your seam allowance, like clip up to where your stitch line is, and press it under if you really wanted to be able to see what the finished look is going to be. If you're making a muslin for a long garment, such as like something that's longer than a tunic length, or a dress that might be like maxi length or something like that, and you really want to be able to save some of your fabric, what you can do is cut it off significantly shorter than whatever the finished length is going to be, and then just hold up a tape measure. You could hold it up, against the center front, and then measure down just to see what your actual finished length would be on your real garment. All right, everyone, I hope that you enjoyed these muslin tips. Do you have any muslin stories yourself? Was there ever a time that you really regretted not sewing a muslin, or Are you a person who normally sews muslins, or do you usually just skip that process? Also, if you have any other muslin questions, just leave them in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to answer them.